Our Earth is a marvel, a planet with forces that never rest. They created what we today call home. Our continents. Each one is unique. Each one shapes the human beings that live on it. In the vastness of the Pacific, the island world of Oceania emerged, home to brave seafarers.
The Polynesians were going thousands of kilometres across the Pacific at the time when Europeans were timidly edging around the Mediterranean.
They covered almost unimaginable distances in their boats and took their culture all the way to New Zealand. For a long time, extremely fierce winds prevented this isolated corner of the world from being settled at all. Further north, Australia, the driest of all inhabited continents.
Australia is a great example of just how adaptable and versatile we are as a human species.
When a continent is created, there are unimaginable forces at work. The Great Australian Bight is 60 meters high and 4,000 kilometers long. It's almost like the birth scar of the continent. Pressed into it are traces that show the formation of Australia. Petrified tree fern, Glossopteris, it loves hot and tropical conditions. But Robert Falcon Scott's famed South Pole expedition also found fossilized Glossopteris in Antarctica, thousands of kilometers from Australia. Antarctica and Australia, siblings could hardly be more different. Today, there are 2,600 kilometers of open sea between the two. But this was not always so. Up till 50 million years ago, they were connected by a narrow land bridge. But under the pressure of violent movements in the Earth's interior, this tore. Caught in powerful ocean currents, Australia and Antarctica drifted towards different fates. On its way south, Antarctica froze over. But Australia drifted north, towards the equator, into the warmth. The world's largest coral reef formed off the coast in the north, the Great Barrier Reef. What sensitive corals need, above all, is the right water temperature. Off the coast of Australia, conditions were ideal until a few decades ago. But man-made climate change is now threatening the wealth of species that has evolved over millions of years. With no land connection, Australia was isolated, a blessing for mammals. No competitive pressure, no predators. Its species adapted to the climatic conditions undisturbed. One group's development was especially diverse, marsupials, like wombats or koalas. But the very flat continent was exposed to hot winds, and these blew sand across the ground, choking the vegetation. The Australian outback became a red desert. Wind and weather filed away at the rock until this 348-meter-high icon was formed. We know it as Ayers Rock, but for people to be able to live here would require, at the very least, a gesture of goodwill from nature. It's not exactly clear how the first Australians arrived here. Perhaps the last ice age cleared a path from Asia to Australia. The sea level is said to have been so low at that time that people were able to move on foot across a 160-kilometre land bridge from Papua New Guinea to the still uninhabited continent.
It wasn't like our ancestors were looking towards the horizon, furrowing their brow and striving off to explore. It was a population dispersal. People would be migrating around as they hunted and gathered to feed themselves. Populations would expand, and you just have this gentle pressure for people to move slowly over the generations into newer and emptier lands.
From the tropical coasts, some moved on to northwestern Australia. With every kilometre, the natural environment held new challenges. Overcoming all obstacles became part of the complex mythology of the first Australians, what they called the dreaming. The traces of this settlement history are still visible today. Here, for example, at Mount Borrowdale. The continent's oldest rock paintings chronicle how humans were challenged by nature. And how they responded. In the dry season, a single spark is enough to ignite huge fires. From the beginning, forest fires were an integral part of the continent's settlement history, but the Aboriginal people learned how to control them.
Our people have been land managers since time began, because that's our responsibility. We're born into this land, and it's our responsibility to take care of it.
The descendants of the first Australians revived the ancient knowledge from tens of thousands of years ago. As rangers, they burn dry grass and undergrowth under controlled conditions. This deprives fires of their fuel.
Absolutely ancient practice. This has been happening for thousands and thousands of years. What that actually does is it reinforces regeneration, it encourages regeneration. We actually have a number of plants, grasses and trees up here that need the fire to actually germinate.
Some types of eucalyptus are absolute forest fire specialists. They survive by having a surface that dissipates fire. The inside of the tree remains unharmed, but their essential oils make them dangerous fire accelerants at the same time.
Terrifying scale
What's
of
happened
Australian
in southern
bushfires.
New South Wales?
Climate change is drying out the continent as never before. The sad result, every year, fires destroy larger and larger areas, especially in the south. On the other hand, the north remains largely spared. This is also because rangers here rely on traditional fire management. In the south, however, raging fires cause more devastation with each year.
One of the possible explanations of why there have been these terrible bushfires in Australia recently is that there hasn't been that active management using kind of local Aboriginal knowledge.
If you look after your country will look after you. To keep our land and ourselves strong, we need to carry on teaching our young ones about our culture, our language, how to take care of the land, how we're connected to the land, because we believe that we actually come out of our land.
The first Australians have wrested much useful wisdom from the Australian bush. The Australian bush flower, when crushed, acts as a mosquito repellent. The etheric oils of paperbark tree work against the common cold or insect bites as they relieve pain and inflammation.
Do you want to smell it?
Yeah, that is potent.
The first Australians also discovered the continent's superfood, small, inconspicuous, but full of energy.
Okay, so everybody gets always surprised when you show them the bush potato. They're imagining this massive potato. I'll have a taste of this one. What do you think?
Tastes exactly like a raw potato. With a little bit of dirt for extra flavour.
Yeah, of course. Tear the seeds apart and then you spread it back out again, so it's gonna regenerate and keep growing.
But much wisdom has been lost. Also because the white way of life was imposed on the Aboriginal people. The stolen generation represents an especially dark chapter in this history. Between 1900 and 1969, an estimated 1 in 3 Aboriginal children was torn from his or her family and given to white families or put in homes. They were meant to grow up with white values and morals, so they said.
Kids were removed from their families, especially when they were of mixed race. One parent black, the other one white. And it was to breed out, I mean, you know the policy, was to breed out the black in those people. That was the general idea, or at least policy at that time. So those kids were removed and sent to white families, mostly down south, and they had to learn what we would say the white way of living, doing things. So yes, that's how they lost touch with their cultural background.
Only a few of the roughly 250 languages are still spoken today. Many Aboriginal people live at the margins of society. Their so-called dot paintings sell well as tourist souvenirs, but they also contain their ancient knowledge about the essence of the continent. This is what helped to make the driest continent in the world habitable. Because the conditions of the red center are hostile to life. Sometimes there's no rain for many years in a row. Instead, it gets blisteringly hot in summer. Kangaroos save energy when they move, thanks to their long leaps. The desert also produces an unusually large number of poisonous creatures because prey is scarce. So the first bite or sting has to be fatal. The reason why there is any life at all in this arid region is due to a huge underground freshwater reservoir. The Great Artesian Basin covers 1/4 of Australia's land area. Water-permeable sandstone, layered alternately with waterproof silt, act like a gigantic sponge. This unique geology makes the Great Artesian Basin the largest water reservoir of its kind. But only when the basin is well filled by rain does the water even reach the surface, in so-called billabongs. Billabong is the name given to these life-givers by the first Australians. It simply means waters. Knowing their location ensured survival. But because the first Australians had no written language, they found another way to preserve their knowledge about the life-giving water.
We are cultured species, and we build up adaptive cultural capital, and that lets us pass on vital skills to survive in certain kind of environments. Actually, the Australian Aboriginals are a kind of famous example of that.
In clans of up to 50, the Aboriginal people moved as nomads from the north across the entire continent. The water points were milestones of their survival. In songs, the so-called song lines, they described navigation routes that led to them. In this way, they succeeded in settling the entire Australian continent. Later, European settlers made use of their water knowledge to cross the huge outback. This is what made cultivation of the hinterland possible at all. Mount Riddoch Farm is 140 kilometres long and 20 kilometres wide. That's average for Australian farms. There are 6,000 cattle here. So little grass grows in the desert that feeding the herd is only possible over such a large area. Keeping the herd together is a dangerous job for the farmer.
You're constantly looking over your shoulder and seeing what the other person's doing and making sure that they're in the right spot and being safe. I mean, some of my guys tell me often, stop telling me not to do that. I need to get hurt somewhere along the line. Yeah.
We don't want that.
If they do, I have to carry their weight, and that's not going to happen.
Twice a year is muster time, rounding up the herd. The 7-member team at the Riddoch Ranch must function as a unit, and directing thousands of polled Hereford cattle is not the only challenge in the outback. Nature shapes every aspect of everyday life.
It is very hard out here. You've still got to check your pipelines, check your water supplies. So it's just like, oh, it's another day. It doesn't really matter. Oh, the pipes burst? We best get in the Toyota and go fix it. Like, yes, it's easier in the city, but this is how we've grown up. This is how we've always wanted to be. This is what we've always wanted to do.
The hard life in the middle of the Australian nowhere has created its own lifestyle. The nearest town, Alice Springs, is 320 kilometres away. In the outback, people depend on each other.
We live together here on the station. We eat together. We socialise together. So for me, mateship and being able to work effectively as a team is probably one of the biggest traits that people need to be able to live and work out here.
Mates, an Australian synonym for friends who go through thick and thin together. The idea of mateship was shaped by soldiers far from home during the First World War. As a cohesive community with a shared destiny, they endured the hardships and cruelties of the battlefield together. Today, mateship is an attitude towards life that unites mainly white Australians, from the outback to the big cities. Saturday morning, 7 a.m. at Manly Beach. Punctually at sunrise, hundreds of bold and beautiful people meet 7 days a week for the Bold and Beautiful Swim. It's much more than sportsmanship that brings them together here.
Let's get in the water.
Anyone who wants and dares to can swim the 1.5 kilometres to Shelley Beach and back.
We swim as a group in a pack, just seeing each other. When you turn your head and breathe, you see your mate on one side, and breathe the other side, you see another mate.
And everyone's looking out for each other. I remember once just stopping to look at the sky and someone came up to me and said, "Are you okay?"
We have a whole mix of people from all walks of life, and yet we're all the same when we're in our Speedos.
We just laugh together and think, we a bunch of crazies, but we're together doing it, and sense of belonging and community, all of that.
People look out for each other if they belong to the group. Maybe also because working communities like this play an important role for Australians, they are world leaders in donor generosity and voluntary work. Because when nature is hostile, solidarity saves lives. In the southeast of the continent, conditions are completely different. Here, Australia has rainforests and eucalyptus forests, mountains, waterways. The backbone of this natural abundance is a coastal mountain range. Its history began over 300 million years ago. The flat coastal region was folded up to over 2,000 meters, becoming a weather divide. The foothills are fertile. Before them lie gentle, navigable coasts, perfect for a nation that found life too cramped at the other end of the world. On January the 18th, 1788, the first 11 ships from England landed. On board were convicts whose job was to build new colonies. The 13-year-old thief, Elizabeth Harwood, was the youngest, and 62-year-old rag picker, Dorothy Handland, the oldest. They weren't felons, but petty criminals. Freedom beckoned if they helped build new towns. The first was Sydney. Even today, its layout indicates the origins of the convict colony. First Street linked the heart of the city with the port. Where the iconic Opera House stands today is where the 18th century colonists set up their first camp. More cities emerged from former prison camps. 1/5 of all Australians are descended directly from one of the original immigrants, and their legacy is right in their language.
Hey, g'day, mate. Glad you came for a coldie.
Cheers. Bit nippy out here, but frothing them waves. Not whinging.
Australians love abbreviations. Derived from flash, the slang used as code by some convicts, researchers have discovered around 5,000 abbreviations in the Australian vocabulary.
Linguists have found that Australians don't use 1/3 of the muscles that could be used for speaking, right? And so that's why there's sort of a lazy intonation in the ways in which Australians speak. And so if you can shorten words or abbreviate them, all the better. You can say things much more quickly.
Abbreviations also help them sound as down-to-earth and friendly as possible because equality is important.
Wait, are you guys going to Robbo's on Sunday?
Totally. Is it BYO?
BYO stands for Bring Your Own, especially alcohol.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to the bottle to pick up a slab.
Packs of canned beer are cheerfully called slabs.
Yeah, no, I'll whack a few in the esky as well.
An esky, abbreviated from the out-of-use Eskimo, it means cool box.
Hey, how's that deadly treadly?
The affectionate rhyming slang nickname for bicycle, also hinting at the fact that cycling isn't so popular here.
Yeah, she's a beauty. Bit too fancy to dig, but I just take her out for a cuppa every now and then.
One of the stories that I've heard about how you can put on an Australian accent and perhaps how it evolved was that you have to pretend it's really hot. So you have to squint, right? It's hot and it's bright and you're squinting. And then you have to keep your mouth shut because there's so many flies about. So if you keep your mouth shut like this, you end up with an Australian accent.
Oh, all right, I'm going to go in a sec.
No worries. I'll see you at Robbo's.
No worries, mate. That's the most commonly used phrase by Australians and the epitome of Australian nonchalance. The fact that Australians like to take a relaxed view of things is part of their self-image. At the same time, Australia is solid with prohibitory signs.
So you have this weird tension between the anti-authoritarianism of the early convicts and the early settlers, but also a recognition that societies need to be governed by laws, etc. The result is that you have a very rule-laden society.
With a variety of strange laws. For instance, it's illegal to be drunk in a pub or to vacuum between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. on weekdays in Melbourne. In Western Australia, anyone who has more than 50 kilograms of potatoes is liable to prosecution. It can also be really expensive. In Sydney, riding a bicycle without a helmet now costs 344 Australian dollars or 225 euros. And anyone who disrupts a wedding in South Australia had better have a good reason. They can be fined up to 10,000 Australian dollars or 2 years in prison.
Australians, even though they have that kind of anti-authoritarian, we're all equal kind of character, they also have quite a submissive or not sheepish, but a character that does like to follow the rules.
It's not only nature's hardships that determine the way of life on the continent. There is also phenomenal geological wealth. There's more zinc, iron ore, and above all, uranium in the Australian outback than would be needed worldwide in the next 100 years at the current rate of consumption. Australia's top export is mined in the Coober Pedy opal mine. 97% of the world's demand for these gemstones comes from here. Even more important economically is coal. It has fueled Australia's economic growth for 30 years, mainly thanks to China's hunger for raw materials. The reason for the wealth lies dormant inside the more than 4.5 billion-year-old Earth. Minerals and metals have been deposited beneath its surface over the course of the planet's history. Researchers continue to puzzle over why they are found where they are. Gold has a particularly strong pull. The discovery of gold changed Australian society dramatically. In 1851, a young Englishman stumbled upon it. He found a 4-kilogram gold nugget in the Macquarie River in Victoria. During the following 20 years, for the first time, voluntary immigrants to the sixth continent outnumbered the convicts. Punitive transports soon stopped altogether. Australia now promised good fortune and riches. But the gold rush had its downsides. Tens of thousands of Chinese laborers were employed to do the heavy work in the mines. They worked well in teams and, unlike the Christian soldiers of fortune, also on Sundays. Conflict was inevitable. At first, there were just ugly caricatures. Then the violence escalated. White prospectors saw the Chinese as rivals. In June 1861, 3,000 of them marched to the Chinese camp. They set fire to it and destroyed their tools. 250 Chinese workers were seriously injured. Fearing retaliation, the government enacted immigration laws that made it difficult for Chinese people to enter the country. A precursor to the White Australia policy enacted in 1901. Non-white people were to be excluded from entering Australia.
The first piece of legislation when Australia federated in 1901 was the White Australia policy, which was a policy restricting migration to Australia to white-only people. But of course, even then, more than 100, 120 years ago, they recognised that you couldn't write that into a policy. So it was the way the policy was enacted. So immigration agents were told to only let in people who could read a paragraph in a language of their choosing. So usually they had to read it in English. But if there was somebody who was of the wrong colour, but who obviously knew English, they were instructed to ask them to read it in Welsh.
Racism and discrimination still divide the country today. According to a 2021 survey, 76% of the Australian population think racism is pervasive in Australia. Many have experienced it personally.
So, you know, Australians very keen on migrants, but migrants under its own terms. So even though we have policies that are defined as multicultural, and that's a very strong element of what Australians are proud of when they talk about Australian identity, we don't actually, we're not all that happy about cultural diversity. We're quite happy to kind of see visible diversity. So in theory, they like the idea of you know, kind of cultural melding or multiculturalism. But in practice, the expectation is one of assimilation.
A closed society that prides itself on its prosperity, relatively few people are faced with such an immense wealth of natural resources. This continues to make Australia an attractive immigration country. Australians have the luxury of being strict about who they let onto their island. Northeast of Australia, nature created a diametric opposite to the driest of all continents, Oceania, an island world consisting of 99.5% water. Land was created here only when nature really let rip. It's easy to guess the genesis of Oceania by taking a look at Mauna Loa, one of the largest active volcanoes on Earth. Around 1 million years ago, it erupted for the first time, along with 400 other volcanoes. They line up to form the Pacific Ring of Fire at the junction between the Australian and Pacific plates. When this seam contracts or expands, the volcanoes come to life and spew magma, liquid rock. In this way, over millions of years, they have given birth to new island groups. Hawaii, Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, they all grew on the volcanic seabed of Oceania and are constantly changing. More than 7,500 islands dot an ocean area of 160 million square kilometers. Nature created special conditions, enabling a habitat to develop for humans in the midst of the saltwater desert. The volcanic magma is like a mineral-rich super fertilizer that creates extremely fertile land. But for humans to survive here, they needed one thing above all: fresh water. And that was available too, thanks to a law of nature. Because of the difference in density, rainwater does not mix with the salty groundwater, but floats in its own bubble. The precious resource can be tapped, used as drinking water and for growing food. Nevertheless, water was scarce, which had consequences. Hierarchical societies developed on the isolated islands. The authority of the clan chief ensured fair distribution of scarce supplies. As soon as a clan became too big, they needed to find new islands. This was made possible by an ingenious invention. Two dugout canoes are connected by cross pieces. The term we use for it today comes from two words, katu, meaning ribbon or bundle, and maram, tree. The catamaran is simple to make and very light. It has no keel and lies very flat and stable on the water. Still the fastest way to sail today. This was how the Polynesians conquered the ocean and their own isolation. But it was not only the scarce resources that drove the courageous sailors out into the Pacific.
It was social factors rather than kind of ecological factors that kind of fueled the migration. In some Polynesian societies, if you're the firstborn son, that's really important. But imagine if you're the second or third. If you're to go to a new island, then you become the kind of founding figure, the founding chief, and there is all this kind of ancestor worship in Polynesian societies. So there were social motives for expanding as well.
The Polynesians discovered new islands thanks to their ability to navigate using the stars. The navigators needed to know above all which star was above the target destination and which was behind their own position. Then, a 32-point compass and plenty of experience helped them to stay on course in the Pacific.
The Polynesians were magnificent navigators. At the time when Europeans were timidly edging around the Mediterranean, here were Polynesians going thousands of kilometers across the Pacific.
The exploration of the South Seas by the Polynesians was one of the greatest maritime achievements in history. The catamarans reached an average cruising speed of 7 to 8 knots, about 13 to 15 kilometers an hour. Like their ancestors, the crew of the Okeanos fleet navigates in the footsteps of the first explorers. In this way, they aim to keep the tradition alive. Thanks to their navigation and shipbuilding skills, the Polynesians conquered an area at sea of 70 million square kilometers in just 1,500 years, an area almost as large as the landmass of the continents of Africa and Asia combined. Their way of life spread from Easter Island to Tahiti and Hawaii. The widely scattered islands became the common cultural area of Oceania. And so, throughout the Pacific region, the archetype of a trendy modern sport was practiced: surfing. On simple boards, the Polynesians rode the tall waves that built up especially during winter storms, and invented surfing, which has been a competitive sport for centuries. In Polynesia, surfing is much more than recreational fun. It is integral to their cultural and spiritual life. It's unclear how many boats set off around 3,400 years ago to explore the island region. Researchers estimate, however, that only 1 in 10 ships arrived. All the more enthusiastic was their reception when they made it back home, as it still is today. Further south, there is only water and plenty of wind. In the absence of land, the sea is whipped up by unchecked violent storms. This phenomenon was known by seafarers as the Roaring Forties, due to the geographical location at the 40th line of latitude. Because of this, it was almost impossible to reach New Zealand by sea for centuries. But in the Middle Ages, 3 time frames opened up with a historical effect. For about 20 to 30 years, the winds shifted. Instead of the southwest, they came from the northeast. Maori, brave conquerors from Oceania, now had a tailwind. They reached what was perhaps the last uninhabited spot on Earth and gave it the name Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, because of the humid air that hung over the mountains and formed clouds there. This humidity provided the breeding ground for lush plant and animal life. New Zealand also lay isolated for the longest time. There are no large mammals. This means there are no predators for birds like the kiwi, which can't fly because it doesn't have to. Its larger ancestor, the moa, was even easier prey. The Maori hunted it to extinction. The groups also fought among themselves for resources. When the English decided to annex New Zealand for the British Crown in 1750, they encountered a battle-hardened opponent.
The Maori were extremely good at warfare and actually launched very successful military campaigns against the British. They're often credited with actually having invented trench warfare. They had these systems of palisades and trenches that they would kind of retreat back behind and inflicted substantial kind of military losses on the English.
Because they could defend themselves, the Maoris secured their rights in 1840 with the Treaty of Waitangi, New Zealand's oldest constitutional document, but as British citizens. Unlike the Aboriginal people and almost all other indigenous peoples in the world, they escaped the suppression of their culture. And in modern-day New Zealand, the Maori, the original inhabitants, are very visible. The haka, the war dance that New Zealand sports teams and Polynesians also perform at international competitions before every game, expresses the warrior heritage of the Maori. It's far more than folklore. The haka is part of everyday culture in New Zealand. Important state visitors are welcomed with a haka as a matter of course. Today, Maori make up about 14% of the total population. Te reo Maori is the official language alongside English, and this doesn't just change the look of the streets. Television programs are also increasingly being broadcast bilingually.
So one of our rangatira announced as Te Pou Whakarai o Aotearoa. Today we celebrate their lives.
The language, it's something to be treasured. It's something that we treasure. And so how do you honour a gift of language? You use it.
Since the 1970s, Te reo Maori has once again been taught in New Zealand's schools. It is a victory for the proud Maori. Their history and customs are not only reflected in history books, but a part of the New Zealand way of life.
So now it's possible in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to do your entire education, all the way up to a PhD, a doctorate, in te reo, if you chose to.
The Maori have contributed to the national identity of all New Zealanders. The entire nation is now proud of its Polynesian roots.
For a long time, our culture was very monocultural. That really got replaced, I think, by this idea of New Zealand being bicultural and having two equal founding cultures, Māori and Pākehā, or Māori and European.
The fact that settlers from Europe and America moved to the other end of the world at all is due to a special feature in nature off the east coast. It's found underwater. The Kaiura Trench deepens off the coast due to the collision of the Australian and Pacific plates. It extends one of the world's great deep-sea trenches and drops steeply from a depth of 1,000 meters to more than 3,000 meters. Here, two currents swirl into each other, one cold, the other warm. This is where Antarctic krill, a kind of shrimp, live in enormous shoals. All anyone has to do, if this is their favorite food, is to open their mouths, just like the humpback whale and other whales. The settlers, in turn, were drawn by the whales. Whale oil was one of the most sought-after resources because during industrialization, it powered machines and, above all, lamps. It was so valuable that the long journey was well worthwhile. From 1842, whalers came from Great Britain, France, the USA, and Canada. The bloody slaughter lasted 20 years until most of the whales were killed or driven away. Part of the whaling fleet moved on. Many settlers stayed. The islands of New Zealand were so far off the beaten track that supply transports from Europe often didn't arrive. While Australia was able just to be supplied, at the far end of the continent, everything was lacking. The number 8 wire mentality of the New Zealanders stands for their way of solving their own problems. It's derived from a narrow gauge wire that could be used for almost anything.
Yeah, it probably goes back to pioneering days. It took a long time for imported goods to arrive in the country. We didn't have an industrial kind of culture. And so people learnt to make do with what they had and repaired things for themselves and became ingenious about figuring out a way to make something work.
Their inventive spirit lives on to this day. Even though New Zealand benefits from globalized trade in the 21st century, not everything arrives as quickly as it's needed. High-tech in particular is in short supply.
We went to go and look for those products internationally and domestically. They just didn't exist, so we had to develop them. So it's been 3 years now, and we've been heavily focused on developing heavy lift drones, as we know that there's going to be a massive need for them in the future.
Cameron Baker and his team intend to use the large drones to save the last remaining primeval forest in New Zealand. Forests like the Tauranga forest once covered the entire North Island. Now, only a few hectares remain, and even these are threatened by pests. Reforestation efforts in this difficult terrain are assisted by homegrown developments.
The idea for that is restoring native forestry to areas that were too difficult or too costly to actually restore by hand, as well as going from, taking days to plant in 1 hectare and costing thousands and thousands of dollars to doing it in using seed bombs by drone. We can do that in a matter of minutes and with only hundreds of dollars instead.
The team has now designed more than 100 different drones, each one perfectly adapted to its application, and all 100% Kiwi, or made in New Zealand. The drone is loaded with homemade seed bombs. The drones are controlled from the ground, but even with a load of 200 kilograms, their range of 100 kilometers is significantly greater than that of conventional models. and even over difficult terrain, the connection is maintained. Sam and Cameron have only been working on their idea for 3 years. They've made a successful start and are developing their technology further to protect New Zealand's forests even better.
Kiwis, New Zealanders do have that number 8 wire mentality. Our team of engineers are experts at thinking outside of the box, which is really useful because a lot of the problems that we see in conservation about how are we going to preserve nature, we need to be thinking outside of the box in how to apply the best solution to preserving nature.
The challenges for the people on this isolated continent are not getting any smaller. The northward drift of the Australian plate, which began 50 million years ago, continues. Every year, Australia moves 7 centimeters northwards, a speed that is not noticeable, yet changes everything noticeably. Every few years, the geographical data has to be adjusted, otherwise coastal roads would suddenly be submerged in the sea. The isolated continent remains in flux, driven by the powerful forces deep within our Earth.